Week 13 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers I have as sleeper options this week. The first kicker, McManus of the Green Bay Packers. Brandon McManus surprisingly still out there in tons of fantasy leagues at 87%. And when healthy this season, he's been a solid kicker. And we know this Green Bay team, they stall out a lot on drives where we know they're a run-first team as well. But this week, obviously, Thanksgiving Day, they know they got to put points on the board at the Lions. It's an indoor game, and usually these two teams do put up points on the board when they verse each other. So the last few games for McManus, Week 10 versus Philly, only 1 fantasy point. Week 11 versus the Giants, he didn't play. And Week 12 versus Minnesota, 12 fantasy points. So this week, like I said, at Detroit, they got to put points on the board. This is Green Bay Packer team. It's an indoor game, which is obviously always a plus for a kicker. And I think McManus could go out there and be a good sleeper option. Next kicker, Zane Gonzalez of the Atlanta Falcons. So this week, a good matchup at the New York Jets, even though the weather could be a little bit shaky with the wind and cold, obviously, in New York. But ever since signing with this Atlanta Falcon team, he's been solid as Zane Gonzalez. Week 10 at the Colts, 6 fantasy points. Week 11 versus the Panthers, 12. And Week 12 at the Saints, 15 fantasy points. So the New York Jets give up the most fantasy points to kickers on the season. Zane Gonzalez shown he could kick 50-plus yards, even though we know a lot of kickers have done it this season, especially consistently week in and week out. But Gonzalez, like I said, he wasn't signed to Week 10 with this Atlanta Falcon team. So this week with a good matchup at the Jets, they give up the most points. I like him as a sleeper option, and he's out there in 97% of fantasy leagues. And the final kicker, Michael Badgley of the Indianapolis Colts. So Badgley's on a high-powered offense, obviously. Indoor game back home for Indianapolis. And Badgley, for the most part, besides that one bad game he had overseas going back to Week 10 versus the Atlanta Falcons, where he missed 2 field goals in that one, he's been a solid kicker for the most part. Week 8 versus Tennessee, 9. Week 9 at Pittsburgh, 12. Week 10 versus Atlanta, 6 fantasy points, like I said. And Week 12 at Kansas City, 7 fantasy points. So this week, Houston Texans, they're versing one of the better defenses in the league, obviously. But they're a bend but don't break type of unit at times as well. And I think Badgley, like I said, the Indianapolis, they get in the red zone a whole lot week in and week out. So I think Badgley could be a good sleeper option this week, and he's available in 90% of fantasy leagues. That's a few kickers I have as sleepers for Week 13 of the fantasy football season.